This video is going to be about consciousness,
William James, and
natural oxide intoxication, and
the effect that drugs might have on the human mind and biology.
so yesterday I was listening to
The Very Bad Razor podcast. Um, it was the episode on burning.
um the civil crisis that we have in America.
The ongoing civil crisis about police brutality, and Harvey Frankfurt bullshit.
And so I was listening to the podcast yesterday, and during the podcast,
When I was doing a section on burning, they mentioned about one of them mentioned about William James experiment he did when he was intoxicated on nitrous oxide. And because I'm a curious person, I paused the podcast and went to look the information out to see if I could learn something from it. And so when I saw it, at first I was like, is he trying to articulate something that all the people cannot just understand? Because sometimes when you see something like that, you might think it's just madness. It's just somebody babbling and talking nonsense because they're just under the influence of drug or something. But before I get into the analysis of the poem he wrote and the analysis of his thought process on Hegel's dialectic, I just want to read something he wrote, something I saw in the article that he wrote towards the end of his life, and he says, "I myself made some observations on nitrous oxide intoxication, and reported them in print. One conclusion was forced upon my mind at that time, and my impression of its truth has ever since remained unshaken. It is our it is that our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness, as we call it, is but one special type of consciousness, while all about it, parted from it by the filmless of screens, there lies potential forms of consciousness entirely different." And so, in that statement, he was basically trying to articulate that his experiment with nitrous oxide um, affected him to the point that he was able to realize one truth in all his life that, from his perspective, was absolute. One truth that he just couldn't disprove or he just couldn't forget. And that truth is that supposedly our rational consciousness, or what human beings have come to grasp and perceive as the rational consciousness, is not the only type of consciousness within this universe and within our own reality. And that is basically to say that there could be different type of consciousnesses existing within our own reality and beyond our reality. And it also means that
our rational consciousness and the way our rational consciousness perceive reality.
it's not technically how other consciousness that are different from our rational consciousness might perceive reality. And as a result, we should always be supposedly alert that our perspective of reality is not the only perspective of reality. Because if a consciousness is different from our consciousness, that consciousness perspective of reality and that consciousness ability to grasp reality through its biological vessel, through its senses that are attached to its biological vessel, might be completely different from our perspective of reality, just based off the fact that our consciousness are completely different and perceive reality from a different perspective.
And in simple English,
For others to understand, he was basically saying some consciousness might perceive reality in a manner where they value certain things. For example, some consciousness might value materialistic things. Some consciousness might value money, wealth, pleasure, sex, and things like that. And so, just because we see consciousness that value those things within our reality, we should not just accept that every consciousness within our reality or beyond our reality is going to value those things still. Because if somebody's consciousness is different from the consciousness that value money, pleasure, power, title, sex, is different from a consciousness that value those things, that person's consciousness is going to have a different perspective on reality, and that consciousness might value things that are beyond money, pleasure, sex, and titles and power. And so that consciousness, for example, might value knowledge, creativity, arts, and stuff like that. And so you should consider or come to accept that our own consciousness is not the only consciousness that exists within our reality and beyond our reality.
And after reading that statement,
Man, I felt like he was able to grasp this idea while he was intoxicated on nitrous oxide, because when you are
intoxicated on drugs
or something, your mind doesn't technically work as the normal rational consciousness will work in certain instances, and so he was able to grasp this truth just by being intoxicated, because his intoxicated mind was able to grasp that the way his consciousness works was not the same way Hegel consciousness works. And so when he ran and read the Hegel dialectic while being intoxicated, he was able to realize that the dialectic, the thought process within the dialectic was completely different from his own thought process. And after he grasped that, he was able to come to the truth that if the thought process in this dialectic is not my typical thought process, then this dialectic is physical proof that there could be multiple consciousness. And if this dialectic is physical proof that there could be multiple consciousness, and this dialectic is a rational dialectic, an intellectual dialectic, it means that there could be multiple rational consciousness that are perceiving reality from different perspectives.
And so, from my analysis of
his quote and having read Hegel dialectic, it's just an example of how sometimes the intoxicated mind is able to grasp something even the rational and sober and intelligent mind just cannot grasp. And since I've gone over that, I'm gonna read first. He left a poem, and he left his analysis of Hegel dialectic when he was intoxicated on nitrous oxide. The poem, he said,
in the poem he says, what is mistake
but a kind of steak? What is nausea but a kind of ausea? Sober, drunk,
astonishment. Everything can be the subject of criticism. How criticize without something to criticize? Agreement, disagreement, emotion, motion. And so when most people read something like this, they'll just
see it as an intoxicated person on drugs just babbling and talking nonsense. But because I like to challenge myself to understand where people thought process come from and what gave birth to the thought process and what led to them expressing the thought process, I was able to come up with a rational analysis of this poem he wrote while intoxicated on nitrous oxide. So the first line, what is mistake but a kind of mistake, is basically saying, isn't it true that mistakes are a product of a different perspective, a take on an action, deed, thought, or behavior? What is mistake but a kind of state? So it's basically, in that line, he's basically saying, isn't it true that the concept of mistake is a product of a different perspective, or a different take on somebody actions, deeds, thoughts, and behavior? Because what somebody might perceive as mistake is basically a product that is supposedly arguing what that person did is wrong and it's not healthy, or it's not just. So from that person's perspective, what that person action is a mistake. But from other people's perspectives, that they might see that person action as not being a mistake, because from another perspective, they might see that person action as just being something supposedly that is within that person's self-interest. So the first line is basically saying, isn't it true that mistakes are a product of a different perspective or take on an action, deed, thought, or behavior? Because that's basically what a mistake is within our physical reality.
The second line, while it's nauseous, but it kind of nauseous.
That line is basically saying, isn't it true that the uncomfortable feeling of sickness and the desire to vomit, known as nausea, is a kind of seasickness or RC, which is a product of motion.
And in that line,
He was trying to grasp and explain a different perspective of nausea. And so I personally have experienced the feeling of nausea when I was mentally ill, battling symptoms of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. There were days where I just felt like
just sick on the inside.
and not myself. So I understand the feeling of nausea. And even though I've never experienced the feeling of seasickness, because I've experienced the feeling of nausea, I kind of understand this feeling of seasickness, because when somebody's on the sea and they have seasickness, they feel unease, they feel anxious, they feel like throwing up. So nausea is just a different take or different perspective of seasickness. So it's basically nausea is basically seasickness without being on the sea.
And he was able to grasp that revelation while intoxicated on nitrous oxide.
And then the third line, sober, drunk, on, astonishment.
That line is basically saying, isn't it true that being drunk
It's a great surprise to a sober mind, especially when you experience the phenomenon for the first time. So, sober, drunk, on, astonishment. Astonishment means something that surprised you. So, the first time, if you never used drugs before, just try to imagine the first time you supposedly felt happy for a new reason. That feeling is similar to the first time people experience the effects of drugs. When you first experience the effects of drugs, it catches you by surprise because your sober mind have never experienced something like that before, or your rational mind has never experienced something like that before. So the first time you experience the phenomenon or the effects of drugs, it catches you by surprise because it's a feeling that you have never experienced before. And so
being drunk is kind of like
it's kind of like what's it called, being intoxicated on drugs. So sober, drunk on astonishment. It's basically saying the effects of being drunk is able
to surprise the sober and rational mind, because it's a
feeling it has never experienced before, and a feeling that the rational mind might not have thought was possible.
And then the next line, everything can become the subject of criticism.
How criticize without something to criticize? And that line is basically saying, if criticism is a product of a different perspective or opinion on something, then isn't it true that everything can be criticized, given that most humans sees the world differently,
and as a result can have different opinions on something? So that is basically saying criticism is basically a different perspective,
a take on something. So,
for example, if somebody
does something that, from your perspective, is unkind, unjust, you might criticize that action. And the fact that you criticizing that action means that your take on that action is supposedly different from that person's take on that action. So criticism is basically a product of having a different perspective or a different opinion on something. Because if you had the same perspective and the same opinion on something, or the same understanding on something, you might not criticize the action, deed, or thought. But the fact that you don't have the same perspective, or the same understanding, or the same opinion on something, might lead you to criticize somebody's action, deeds, or thoughts, or behavior if you think that person's actions, deed, thought, or behavior is unkind, or unfair, or unjust from your perspective. And so criticism is basically a product of of a different perspective or opinion on something.
And as a result, everything
Is subjective to criticism, because every
because just on the surface of the earth, humans have different opinions and see the world from different perspectives at times. Which means, so long as people have different
opinions, because they are perceiving the world from a different perspective, there will always be criticism within our universe, because everything is subjective to criticism based off the fact that intellectual beings do not all see the world from the same perspective.
and so that's basically why the line everything can become the subject of criticism mean. And then the next line, how criticize without something to criticize. That line is basically saying
If everything can be criticized, is it possible to criticize things if there isn't anything around for you to criticize?
so that line is basically asking, if there isn't anything around for people to criticize, is it possible for people to criticize things? If criticism is just a different opinion or perspective of things, and so it's basically saying,
If you were to erase everything within our universe, everything, all the matter, all the stars, everything, even the black holes, will there still be something for intelligent beings to criticize?
and so it's basically asking, if there's nothing for people to criticize or intelligent beings to criticize, would there still be
Misunderstanding or chaos within the society or the reality? That's why it's basically asking.
And the answer is, if there is nothing to criticize,
Then you can't criticize anything, because criticism is a different perspective, a different opinion on something. So if there's nothing to criticize, you really cannot, intelligent beings really cannot criticize anything apart from their own self.
and so the next line is saying, are you in agreement of this logic, or are you in a disagreement of this logic? And my analysis is, isn't criticism a part of
Intelligent life in this beautiful universe of ours, given that even if you were to erase everything in existence, including black holes, intelligent beings will still be able to argue about the darkness that is a product of the vacuum of space. So my argument is, yes, I'm in agreement that if there is nothing to criticize, you cannot criticize anything at all. But because within our universe, it's impossible for us to not be able to criticize anything, because even if we were to erase everything within our universe, all the stars, all the matters, all the gases, all the planets, all the black holes, we will still be forced to
criticize the darkness that is the vacuum of space. Because even if we were to erase everything, the darkness that is the vacuum of space will still exist. And because that darkness
will still exist, intelligent beings will still have something to criticize, because there is no way to erase the darkness that is the vacuum of space. So based off that fact, intelligent beings within our universe will always have something to criticize, because even if you just to erase everything, they will still have the darkness of space,
the darkness that is the vacuum of space to criticize, and their own biological vessels and their own actions to criticize. Because intelligent being within this universe, based off the reality we have on Earth, exists within biological bodies, but could exist within mechanical bodies and other bodies too. So just based off the fact that they exist within a vessel means that there will always be something for them to criticize, because their existence is attached to a vessel,
and there will always be something for them to criticize, because even the vacuum of space has darkness within it. So there will always be something to criticize based off those tools ideas. And so,
even though I'm in agreement that if there is nothing to criticize, you can't criticize anything,
the fact is, within our universe,
criticism is a part of intelligent life, because there's no way for us to exist without being able to criticize anything. And then the last line is emotion. And so if you agree that the poem is uplifting, is up, so it's basically saying, are you in agreement that this poem, the line before that, are you in agreement that this poem is uplifting knowledge or madness?
And if you agree that it's uplifting knowledge, then you also have to agree that an intoxicated mind has advantages too over the rational and sober mind.
And the last line, motion and emotion, is basically saying,
If motion is the process, if motion is the action or process of moving or being moved, then is an emotion similar to motion, given that they are movements. Give,
if motion is the action or process of moving or being moved, then isn't emotions similar to motion, given that they are moving feelings that have the power to move humans to act in action, deeds, thoughts, and behavior? So it's that the last line basically saying, is motion and emotion similar? And the analogy is, yes, motion and emotion are very similar, because being in motion means that you are either moving or being moved by something. That's what being in motion is.
and so that concept is similar to emotions because emotions are feelings that supposedly feels like that is designed to move human beings to act, to
Think and behave in a certain manner. And so because emotion is very similar to motion based off its
effects on human being and human biology,
is they are basically
very similar concepts too. Because being in motion means moving or being moved by something.
emotion is just the feeling that supposedly feels like a moving feeling within you.
And also have the capability of moving you to act, think, or behave in certain manners. So
That was the analysis of the poem he wrote on while being intoxicated on natural.
on nitrous oxide.
And the second analysis is going to be about his supposedly revelation he received
After he tried to
to analyze Hegel's dialectic while being intoxicated on nitrous oxide. And he started off by saying, don't you see the difference? Don't you see the identity?
constantly opposites united. The seeming telling you to write and not to write. A scream, a scream, a scream. Within the extensity that a scream contains is contained the scream of intensity. Something
And other than that thing.
by
Draws nothing but all thing. That sounds like nonsense, but it is pure nonsense. Thought much deeper than speech. Medical school, divinity school, school. Oh my God, oh God, oh God. So if you so
when most people see something like that, like the previous one I just analyzed, they might think it's just a man talking madness or just a man who have lost touch of reality because he's intoxicated on natural oxide, and so natural oxide is supposed to be a bad product for the body and the human mind. But if you take a closer look, like I said, I like to analyze things to see where the thought process comes from and what led to the thought process and what gave birth to the thought process. And so
for my analysis
of this
this
take on Hegel's dialectic from William James, this is the take that basically gave birth to the first statement I read.
and my analysis is for the first line, don't you see the difference? Don't you see the identity? The first line is basically saying, can you all see the physical proof? Can you all see the design? And that's basically what I got from
From reading, don't you see the difference? Don't you see the identity? Can't you all see the physical proof, which is the thought process within Hegel dialectic? Can't you all see the design of the thought process within Hegel dialectic? Isn't this thought process completely different from our normal and rational thought process? If yes, then can't you all grasp where I'm coming from with this analysis? Because if our normal thought process is not the same as the thought process within Hegel's dialectic. It means that Hegel consciousness was perceiving reality from a different perspective than our normal rational consciousness. And so the first line, don't you see the difference? Don't you see the identity? Is basically saying, can you all see the physical proof? Can you all see the design? The physical proof that Hegel left of his consciousness being different from the rational consciousness. The physical proof is in the dialectic.
The second line is saying constantly opposite united. That line is basically saying,
can't you all see that within Hegel's dialectic, opposites are able to unite and become one?
And that
analysis is basically saying, that analysis is basically saying, are in the human conscience, ego
and consciousness biological opposites in nature that are entwined and yoked within the same space, i.e., the animalistic brain? Constantly opposite united. The human conscience have a different nature, biological nature, than the human ego and the human consciousness. And yet, they all exist within the human brain. So within the human brain, there are opposites nature that are coexisting unitedly
within the human brain.
And so that is the design that supposedly Hegel was trying to explain
from a physical reality perspective, because you can also observe it within the physical reality.
It's just basically saying
the master enslaved dialectic, the master enslaved interaction.
And the next line, the seeming telling you to right and not to right. That line is basically saying, if the former things are true, if people have different consciousness, if supposedly there's a master and slave
reality within the human conscience too, within the human consciousness, and there's a master and slave reality within the physical human reality, then it's in madness to think that
the same being throughout history
has been telling us how to act and behave and how not to act and behave.
And that's basically saying, if
somebody was similar consciousness as Hegel were to write something,
would that person consciousness
and perspective reality be different than Hegel's consciousness and perspective of reality, or would they have similar arguments? If they have similar arguments, then can't you argue that Hegel consciousness and that person consciousness are supposedly an entity of the same being, and they are supposedly telling humans how to act and how not to act based off what is going within their own mind and based off what is going within the physical reality, and what they are able to rationalize is healthy and not healthy.
And then the next line, which is basically saying, extreme within the intensity that extreme contains the extreme of intensity. Extensity, the first one was extensity. Intensity, something and other than that thing. So that line is basically saying, if the former thing is true, which is, if it's not mad to wonder if the same being has been telling humans how to act and not to act from one generation to the next based off the design of the human mind and brain, and you can actually see the physical proof within Hegel's dialectic of how his consciousness is different from our consciousness, our rational and normal consciousness, and we can also see the design of the ego, the conscious, and the consciousness all existing together in spite of having different biological natures within the brain. Then, isn't it also true that supposedly there can be more extinctions to the human brain? And for that, I mean,
isn't it also true that the human conscience can also have more extinctions? Isn't it also true that the human consciousness can also have more extinctions? Isn't it also true that the human id or ego can have more extinctions based off the fact that a human being is capable of having opposite
opposite entities
coexist within the same biological brain at the same time, like the conscience, the ego, and the consciousness. And the conscience and the ego is just an extension of the human consciousness. If the human consciousness has extensions, isn't it possible for there to be more extensions to the human consciousness, or to the human conscience, or to the human ego and it? And if the answer is yes, if the answer is rationally yes, then isn't it also isn't it also evidence that supposedly that the concept of mental illness is nonsense based off the fact that the human consciousness have extinctions, and given that the human consciousness has extinctions, the human consciousness can have more extensions, and the human consciousness and ego can have more extensions too. And so that is basically saying, if the human mind and brain have extensions, i.e. the conscious and ego, then is it madness to think that there could be more extensions, especially within the human conscience? And then it is also saying, if the former arguments are rational and can be seen within our physical reality, is it mad to think that is it still rational to think that mental illness is nonsense, or does it make beyond rational sense based on the design of the human brain and mind, which are able to contain things other than its own consciousness and belief? Which means, and that line basically, that analysis basically came from something and other than that thing. If something can exist and something else other than that thing can also exist within the same contained space, then it's a madness to think that it's a madness to say that there isn't no physical evidence of mental illness within our physical reality, just based off the fact that the human consciousness is one thing, the human conscience is another thing, the human ego is another thing. So if the human consciousness has extensions of other things that can also coexist within the human brain, then it's a madness to argue that mental illness is just a figment of people's imagination. If the mental ill mind can just be a mind, a consciousness with more extensions. And after that, the argument after that is by draws nothing or a thing. That sounds like nonsense, but it's pure sense. So the fact that based off the design of the human mind, based off the design of the human consciousness having extinctions, and based off the design of the human consciousness not all being the same, while once perceived as nonsense, mental illness actually make rational sense based off the biological design of the human mind and the human consciousness. And if those things make rational sense, then the next line, which is saying, that sounds like thought much deeper than speech. And that's basically saying, if yes, is it really mad to wonder if the same thing has been telling humans how to act and not to act from one generation to the next based on the design of the human mind and brain? And if the human mind and brain have extensions, i.e. the conscious and ego, then it's a madness to think that there could be more extensions, especially within the human consciousness. And so is mental illness still nonsense, or does it make rational sense based on the design of the human brain and mind, which are able to contain things other than its own consciousness and belief? If yes, isn't it true that our human alphabet system were designed to capture the thought processes that are beyond the biology, society, reality, speech, and personal and unconscious biases to guide mankind on a healthier path from one generation to the next? So that's basically saying that was basically my analysis of that first paragraph. And then and another physical evidence of extension is the fact that the human mind is able to hold multiple beliefs at the same time. If the human mind is able to hold multiple beliefs, multiple systems of belief, or understand multiple systems of the beliefs at the same time, then shouldn't it also be possible or physical evidence that there could be more extensions to the human mind too.
And then the last line saying, the last paragraph, by draws nothing or other. That sounds like nonsense, but it's pure nonsense. Taught mercy deeper than speech. Medical school, divinity school, school. Oh my God. Oh God, oh God. That is basically saying if all the things I just said is possible and make rational sense, then isn't it also possible for a human who is in medical school or political school or financial school or historical school or musical school or mathematical school or etc within the physical reality is also able to be in divinity school or school of the conscience or God's or creation within their own mind? If it is possible for humans who are majoring biology or music or mathematics and stuff like that within the physical reality and is also experiencing symptoms of mental illness within the mind, isn't it also true that that person is supposedly experiencing education from two different perspectives of school at the same time? And a simple example would be that for me, I was a political science major, and my first real symptoms of mental illness started in 2014. So I was on campus at Drexel University, majoring in political science, studying political science, and at the same time, I was experiencing phenomena in my mind that was making me more spiritual and more religious and more what's it called, and more philosoph- more spiritual, more religious, and more philosophical within my mind. So I was majoring in political science, studying political science, and at the same time, I was also studying other things within my own mind. And so he's basically saying it is possible for a human being to also be majoring in medical school and at the same time studying other things within their own mind because of what is going on within the brain and within the consciousness and within the what's it called, the mind. So that is basically his argument in that line. And so, and his analysis was if that is possible, then oh my God, oh God, oh God, then what we perceive of life is not supposedly the absolute design of life, which means the absolute design of life is supposedly beyond our rational comprehension and our sober thought process. And if that is true, then how can we argue that our belief, our absolute truth and reality, if there's other extension to the mind and brain that we are not experiencing, and that we haven't been able to learn about that is also not being taught to us. And that was basically his analysis of Hegel dialectic. And so I will read the analysis one more time, and that will read my analysis without what's it called, explaining them. Don't you see the difference? Don't you see the identity? Constantly opposite united. The same mean telling you to write and not to write. Scream. Within the extensity that a scream contains is contained the scream of intensity. Something and other than that thing. By draws nothing but a thing. That sound like nonsense, but it is pure nonsense. Taught mercy deeper than speech. Medical school, divinity school. Oh my God, oh God, oh God. William James. Can you all see the physical proof? Can you all see the design? If not, I am the human conscience, ego, and consciousness biological opposites in nature that are entwined and yoked within the same space, i.e., the animalistic brain. If yes, is it really mad to wonder if the same being has been telling humans how to act and not to act from one generation to the next based on the design of the human mind and brain? And if the human mind and brain have extensions, that is, the conscience and ego, then is it madness to think that there could be more extensions within the human, especially within the conscience. And so, is mental illness still nonsense, or does it make beyond rational sense based on the design of the human brain and mind, which are able to contain things other than its own consciousness and belief? If yes, isn't it true that our humanly alphabet system were designed to capture thought processes that are beyond the biology, society, reality, speech, and personal and unconscious biases to guide mankind on a healthier path from one generation to the next? If yes, isn't it also true that a human being can be in medical, political, financial, historical, musical, mathematical, and etc. schools within the physical reality while also being in divinity school, that is the school of the conscience and gods and creationists within the mind? If yes, don't we also need a school for the conscience, gods, and creationists on the surface of the earth? If yes, isn't it mind-boggling? So that was my analysis of his revelation he received on the Hegel dialectic when he tried to understand what being unnatural is oxide. And the other thing I wanted to say is just the fact that the fact that there could be multiple consciousness within our own reality, multiple different consciousness that are perceiving reality from different perspectives through the same senses, or through senses that everybody else are not experiencing. That is the physical proof that our perspective or our idea of what truth is technically isn't absolute. And so if there's physical evidence of all those things within our physical reality, then medical science also has to be able to adapt and adjust, because what medical science is claiming to be absolute has some physical evidence to prove that the analysis is not absolute. And one of those things is the understanding of mental illness. Another one is the understanding of biology. Another one is the understanding of the human mind and consciousness. Medical science thoroughly do not understand this thing enough for them to be claiming that the collection of knowledge they have right now to be absolute beyond a reasonable doubt. And so that's one of the reasons I made this video, just to articulate that concept. Another reason was because it was just to articulate the concept that our rational consciousness is not supposed to be It's not supposed to be alter reality, which means sometimes drugs or the experience of drugs can help people understand things that the rational consciousness are unable to grasp. And this experiment by William James is an example of that. And so, just to make the assumption that people on drugs supposedly are unable to contribute to reality because drug is just unhealthy, and there's no advantages to drugs and stuff like that, is also not completely absolute, because William James, one of the smartest guys during his era, was able to experience something while being intoxicated on nitrous oxide that is supposedly uplifting to other people who are able to understand it. And so that was supposed to be another one of my arguments, and why I made this video. But I think I've said enough, and so I'm just gonna cut it off right here. Thanks for listening.